Tonight, we'll journey through the life of a man who saw an apple fall from a tree, and in that simple moment, glimpse the mathematical harmony that orchestrates our entire universe. A solitary figure who spent countless hours in quiet contemplation, using nothing but the power of thought to revolutionize our understanding of light, motion, and the forces that bind our world together. Born in a time of civil war and upheaval, he would grow to establish order amid chaos, not through military might or political power, but through the elegant precision of numbers and equations. He was a contradictory soul, brilliant yet troubled, innovative yet traditional, capable of intense focus yet prone to bitter disputes. Though he unveiled the mechanics of the cosmos, he remained in many ways as mysterious as the heavens he studied. His work touches our lives every moment of every day, from the glasses that correct our vision to the understanding of why the moon circles our Earth and why our Earth circles the sun. The mathematical language he invented is still used by scientists to describe everything from the flight of a ball to the orbit of distant planets. This is the story of Sir Isaac Newton. On a cold Christmas morning in 1642, while England was torn apart by civil war, a premature baby boy was born in a modest stone farmhouse in Woolsthorpe, Lincolnshire. So tiny and frail was this infant that few expected him to survive the day. His father, a prosperous but uneducated farmer, also named Isaac, had died 3 months before his son's birth, never knowing the boy who would one day change the world's understanding of it. The baby's mother, Hannah Ayscough, named her fragile son after his late father. The midwife who attended the birth would later recall that the newborn was so small he could fit inside a quart mug. Yet despite his tenuous entry into the world, young Isaac clung to life with the same tenacity that would later characterize his pursuit of knowledge. Young Isaac's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of the English Civil War, a time when old certainties were being questioned and overturned. When he was just 3 years old, his mother remarried a wealthy clergyman named Barnabas Smith, who lived in the neighbouring village. The marriage arrangement included the condition that young Isaac would not join the new household, but would instead remain at Woolsthorpe under the care of his maternal grandmother. This early abandonment by his mother left deep emotional wounds that never fully healed. Throughout his life, Newton's personal journals would reveal the pain of this perceived rejection. In one list of sins he compiled as a young man, he included threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. Such was the depth of his childhood resentment. For 8 years, Isaac lived separated from his mother, growing increasingly introspective and self-reliant. When his stepfather died in 1653, Hannah returned to Woolsthorpe with 3 new children, Isaac's half-siblings. The 10-year-old Isaac, who had grown accustomed to solitude and independence, now found himself part of a family unit again, though never quite fitting in. Despite the emotional turbulence of his early life, Isaac displayed remarkable mechanical aptitude. He crafted ingenious toys and devices, miniature windmills, water clocks, and a wooden lantern powered by candle convection. His formal education began at the village schools in Skillington and Stoke, where he learned basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Though not initially outstanding in his studies, he showed an unusual persistence, often working through problems long after his classmates had moved on to other tasks. When Isaac turned 12, his mother, recognizing something special in her firstborn son, withdrew him from working on the family farm and sent him to the King's School in Grantham. There he boarded with the local apothecary, William Clark, whose well-stocked shelves of chemicals and medicines may have sparked Newton's lifelong interest in alchemy and the composition of matter. At first, Newton's academic performance was unremarkable. He sat near the bottom of his class, seemingly disinterested in the classical curriculum focused on Latin grammar and literature. This changed after a schoolyard altercation with a larger boy who physically bullied him. Rather than seeking revenge through strength, Newton determined to outdo his tormentor academically. He rose rapidly through the class ranks, eventually becoming the top student. The headmaster of King's School, Henry Stokes, soon recognised Newton's exceptional abilities and gave him special attention. Under Stokes' guidance, Isaac began to flourish, particularly in mathematics, though such subjects formed only a small part of the standard curriculum of the time. During these years in Grantham, Isaac lived largely in his own mental world. He forged few close friendships with his peers, preferring the company of books and ideas. He did, however, develop a tender attachment to the apothecary's stepdaughter, Catherine Storer. This youthful affection would remain one of the few romantic connections in Newton's otherwise solitary life. Newton's education at King's School was briefly interrupted when his mother, widowed for a second time, summoned him home at age 16 to manage the family estate. Hannah envisioned her son as a gentleman farmer, continuing the family's agricultural tradition. But Isaac proved a terrible farmer. He would wander off to read under a tree, forgetting about the sheep he was supposed to be watching. When sent to sell produce at the market, he would leave the servants to handle transactions while he retreated to the apothecary's attic to pore over books. Recognizing that her son's talents lay elsewhere, Hannah was eventually persuaded by her brother, William Ayscough, and Newton's former teacher, Henry Stokes, to allow Isaac to complete his education. In 1661, at the age of 18, Newton was enrolled at Trinity College, Cambridge, marking the beginning of his formal scientific training. Newton arrived at Cambridge as a subsizar, a student who earned his keep by performing menial tasks for wealthier students. He cleaned rooms, served at table, and ran errands in exchange for his education. This humble beginning at one of England's most prestigious institutions highlighted the class divisions of the day, yet also demonstrated Newton's determination to pursue knowledge regardless of social obstacles. The Cambridge that Newton entered was still recovering from the upheaval of the Civil War and Commonwealth period. With the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II just a year earlier, traditional Aristotelian philosophy was once again being taught, though new scientific ideas were beginning to circulate among more progressive thinkers. Newton's early days at Cambridge were not particularly distinguished. The standard curriculum, with its emphasis on Aristotle and classical authors, held little interest for him. Instead, he immersed himself in the works of modern philosophers and scientists, René Descartes, Robert Boyle, and astronomers like Johannes Kepler. These thinkers were challenging the ancient Greek worldview that had dominated European thought for centuries. In his private notebooks, Newton began to develop his own ideas, particularly in mathematics. He absorbed Euclid's elements so thoroughly that he found the proofs to be almost self-evident. Moving beyond the university's prescribed texts, he delved into more advanced mathematical works, teaching himself analytical geometry and the latest developments in algebra. Newton's intellectual independence was evident from the beginning. Rather than passively accepting the established curriculum, he created his own program of study. In a small notebook he titled Questiones Quaedam Philosophicae, certain philosophical questions, begun in 1664, he jotted down thoughts and questions on topics ranging from atoms and light to perception, and even the nature of God. The notebook reveals a mind that was not merely collecting knowledge, but actively interrogating it. Plato is my friend, Aristotle is my friend, but my best friend is truth, he wrote, signalling his willingness to challenge even the most revered authorities if their ideas did not align with his own observations and reasoning. In 1665, Newton received his bachelor's degree from Cambridge. It was an achievement, certainly, but gave little indication of the intellectual revolution he was quietly nurturing. That same year, however, events beyond his control would create the conditions for his most productive period of scientific discovery. In the summer of 1665, an outbreak of bubonic plague swept through London and began spreading to other parts of England. As the death toll mounted, Cambridge University made the decision to close its doors, sending students and faculty to the safety of the countryside. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe Manor, the home of his birth. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable period of sustained intellectual creativity in scientific history, Newton's Annus Mirabilis, or Year of Wonders. This period of isolation at Woolsthorpe allowed the young scholar, not yet 25 years old, to develop ideas that would eventually transform science. Away from the distractions and prescribed curriculum of Cambridge, with nothing but time and his own thoughts for company, Newton's mind ranged freely across mathematics, optics, and the laws governing motion. The famous apple, whether it truly fell before his eyes or served as a convenient metaphor, prompted him to consider why objects always fall straight to the earth rather than sideways or upward. During these plague years, Newton laid the groundwork for calculus, a new branch of mathematics capable of describing change and motion with unprecedented precision. He called it the method of fluxions, conceiving of quantities as flowing rather than static. This mathematical innovation would prove essential for describing the physical laws he was beginning to formulate. In the field of optics, Newton conducted his first experiments with prisms during this period. Using a small hole in his window, shutters to admit a narrow beam of sunlight, he placed a prism in the beam's path and observed how it split the white light into a spectrum of colours. This seemingly simple experiment challenged the prevailing theories about light and colour, leading Newton to conclude that white light was not pure, but composed of all the colours of the rainbow, and perhaps most significantly, he began contemplating the nature of gravity. The popular story of the falling apple, first recorded by his friend William Stukely, may be embellished, but the core insight was revolutionary. The same force that pulls an apple to the ground might extend infinitely into space, diminishing with distance, but never disappearing completely. Could this same force be what keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth? Newton did not publish any of these groundbreaking ideas immediately. Instead, he returned to Cambridge when the university reopened in 1667, bringing with him the seeds of scientific revolution that would transform our understanding of the physical world. Back at Cambridge, Newton was elected a minor fellow of Trinity College, securing his position in the academic world. In 1669, before he had published any of his revolutionary work, his mentor, Isaac Barrow, stepped down from the prestigious Lucasian chair of mathematics and recommended Newton as his successor. At just 26 years old, Newton assumed one of the most distinguished positions in British academia. As Lucasian professor, Newton was required to deliver regular lectures. Characteristically, he often lectured to empty halls, not because students weren't interested, but because the material he presented was so advanced that few could follow it. Those lectures that did attract an audience were frequently on his optical experiments, rather than the mathematical theories he was developing privately. In 1672, Newton was elected to the Royal Society, Britain's premier scientific organisation, after donating a reflecting telescope of his own design. Unlike previous telescopes that used lenses, Newton's instrument used mirrors, avoiding the colour distortion or chromatic aberration that plagued refracting telescopes. Shortly after his election, Newton submitted his first scientific paper to the Royal Society, titled New Theory about Light and Colours. In it, he described his prism experiments and his revolutionary conclusion that white light was not elemental, but composed of a spectrum of colours that could be separated and recombined. This publication marked Newton's entry into the wider scientific community and his first taste of scientific controversy. Robert Hooke, the Royal Society's curator of experiments and a formidable intellect in his own right, criticised Newton's conclusions. This criticism stung Newton deeply and initiated a pattern that would mark his scientific career, brilliant insights, followed by fierce defense of his ideas against any who questioned them. Newton's sensitivity to criticism led him to withdraw from scientific publication for several years. Instead, he turned to other interests, including alchemy and biblical chronology. Yet even as he publicly retreated, he continued his scientific work in private, meticulously developing his theories of motion and universal gravitation. The mid-1670s saw Newton engaged in an extensive alchemical research program. He outfitted a laboratory in his rooms at Trinity College, where he conducted hundreds of experiments, carefully recording the results in coded notebooks. While modern science distinguishes sharply between chemistry and alchemy, Newton saw them as complementary approaches to understanding the composition and transformation of matter. His alchemical research reflected his broader philosophical view that nature's secrets could be uncovered through both observation and interpretation of ancient wisdom. Though these pursuits might seem at odds with his mathematical work, for Newton, they were part of a unified quest to comprehend the divine order underlying the physical world. Throughout this period, Newton also immersed himself in theological studies, learning Hebrew so he could read the Old Testament in its original language and writing extensive commentaries on biblical prophecies. He became convinced that the architecture of the universe and the words of Scripture were complementary revelations of divine truth, waiting for the right interpreter to decode them. Newton's theological views were unorthodox by the standards of his time. He privately rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, the belief that God exists as three persons in one being, a position that could have cost him his position at Cambridge had it become widely known. This theological nonconformity perhaps helped shape his independent scientific thinking, reinforcing his willingness to question established dogma in all fields. By the early 1680s, scientific questions began to reclaim Newton's primary attention. The catalyst was a visit from astronomer Edmund Halley, later famous for identifying the comet that bears his name, in August 1684. Halley came to Cambridge to ask Newton a specific question: what shape would the orbit of a planet take if it were acted upon by a force that diminished with the square of its distance from the Sun? Without hesitation, Newton replied, "An ellipse." When Halley expressed surprise and asked how he knew, Newton explained that he had already calculated it years before. After searching through his papers, however, he could not immediately locate the proof. He promised to send it later and, in fulfilling this promise, embarked on one of the most significant scientific projects in history. What began as a short treatise expanded over the next 18 months into Newton's masterwork, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, commonly known as the Principia. In this monumental text, Newton presented a comprehensive system of mathematical physics that explained motion both on Earth and in the heavens. The publication of the Principia in 1687 marked the culmination of Newton's scientific thought and the beginning of a new era in our understanding of the physical world. The work, written in dense Latin and filled with geometric proofs rather than the calculus Newton had developed, but not yet published, was immediately recognized by the scientific community as extraordinary, even if few could fully comprehend it. In the Principia, Newton presented his three laws of motion, principles that would govern physics for more than 2 centuries until Einstein's relativity theory offered a more comprehensive framework. First, that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and direction, unless acted upon by a force. Second, that the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force acting upon it and inversely proportional to its mass. And third, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. These deceptively simple statements provided a unified framework for understanding motion in all its forms, from a simple stone thrown by hand all the way up to the complex movements of planets around the Sun. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the Principia was Newton's universal law of gravitation. He proposed that every particle of matter in the universe attracts every other particle with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. With this single mathematical expression, Newton united the earthly physics of falling apples with the celestial mechanics of orbiting planets. The sky and the ground were no longer separate. For the first time, both were governed by the same principles, expressed in the precise language of mathematics. It was a breathtaking intellectual achievement that fundamentally changed how humans understood their place in the cosmos. The publication process itself reflects something of Newton's character. When he learned that the Royal Society, which had agreed to publish the work, lacked sufficient funds, Edmund Halley personally financed the printing. Newton, despite his wealth, did not offer to contribute, and when Robert Hooke claimed that Newton had taken his ideas about the inverse square law without acknowledgement, Newton threatened to withdraw the third volume of the Principia altogether, relenting only after much diplomacy from Halley. Indeed, Newton's relationship with Hooke deteriorated further after the Principia's publication. The two men, perhaps the greatest scientific minds of their generation, became locked in a bitter rivalry that would last until Hooke's death in 1703. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout Newton's life: brilliant collaboration followed by interpersonal dispute, as his fierce pride and sensitivity to criticism poisoned potentially fruitful relationships. Despite these personal difficulties, Newton's scientific reputation soared in the years following the Principia's publication. His name became synonymous with scientific genius, and his work began to transform, not just physics, but the very way science was conducted. The Principia established a model of mathematical physics that emphasized precise measurement, mathematical modeling, and the formulation of universal laws that could be tested through observation. However, the decade following the Principia's publication was not without personal challenges for Newton. By 1693, something cracked. He stopped sleeping. He wrote strange letters, accusing friends of betrayal, accusing Locke of trying to entangle him with women. His mind, usually so precise, had started to fray. This episode, which Newton later apologized for, may have been exacerbated by mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments. Whatever the cause, it marked a turning point in his life. After recovering, Newton began to seek a position away from Cambridge, perhaps recognizing that the isolated, intensely academic life was taking a toll on his mental health. In the meantime, Newton continued his scientific work, particularly in the field of optics. Throughout the 1690s, he refined the experiments and theories he had first developed during his Year of Wonders. The result was his second great scientific work, Optics, which he prepared for publication but held back, only releasing it after Hooke's death in 1704. Unlike the Principia, which was written in Latin and filled with mathematical proofs, Optics was written in English and emphasized experimental results that could be replicated by others. It detailed Newton's discoveries about the nature of light, including his demonstration that white light contains all the colors of the spectrum, his explanations of the rainbow, and his investigations into the phenomenon of colored rings in thin films, today known as Newton's rings. The book also contained speculations about the particulate nature of light, what Newton called corpuscles, which would influence scientific thought about light for generations. Though we now understand light as having both wave-like and particle-like properties, Newton's particle theory was an important step in the development of modern physics. Optics concluded with a series of questions or queries that revealed the breadth of Newton's curiosity and the speculative dimensions of his thought. These queries ranged from practical matters like the improvement of telescopes to profound questions about the nature of matter, light, and divine action in the universe. They would inspire researchers for generations to come, pointing toward new areas of investigation, even as they revealed the limits of scientific knowledge in Newton's time. By the late 1690s, Newton's scientific work had transformed humanity's understanding of the physical world. His laws of motion and gravitation provided a mathematical framework that explained everything from the fall of an apple to the orbit of the planets. His work on optics had revolutionized our understanding of light and color, and his development of calculus, though not yet published, had created a mathematical tool that would prove essential for the further development of physics. Yet for all these monumental achievements, Newton remained in many ways a solitary figure, respected and renowned certainly, but also somewhat isolated by his difficult personality and unconventional private beliefs. As the century drew to a close, however, new opportunities would draw Newton out of the academic cloister and into a more public role. The seeds of this transition were planted in 1696, when Charles Montague, Earl of Halifax, a former student at Trinity, and now a rising political star, offered Newton the position of Warden of the Royal Mint. Tired of academic life and perhaps seeking new challenges, Newton accepted the offer and moved to London, effectively ending his active research career at the age of 53, though his most productive scientific work had concluded years earlier. Though initially conceived as a sinecure, a position requiring little actual work, Newton approached his new role with characteristic thoroughness and intensity. The appointment came at a critical time for England's economy, as the nation was engaged in a major recoinage to address the problem of counterfeit currency that was undermining public confidence in the monetary system. Newton applied his analytical mind to the practical problems of minting currency, improving the production processes, and taking an active role in prosecuting counterfeiters, a crime then punishable by death. He personally conducted investigations, interrogated suspects, and even went undercover in taverns to gather evidence against criminal networks. It was a surprising new chapter for a man who had spent most of his life in abstract contemplation of the universe's deepest mysteries. At 53, Newton began an unexpected chapter. He left behind the quiet halls of Cambridge for the clatter of coin presses and the intrigue of London. The Royal Mint would be his new world. Where once he had contemplated the abstract movements of celestial bodies, he now concerned himself with the very tangible circulation of gold and silver coins. In 1699, his diligence was rewarded with a promotion to Master of the Mint, a position he would hold for the remaining 28 years of his life. As Master, Newton supervised the production of England's currency with meticulous attention to detail. He standardized the weight and composition of coins, improved manufacturing techniques, and established quality control measures that significantly reduced counterfeiting. Under his administration, the mint became a model of efficiency and precision, reflecting the same mathematical rigor Newton had brought to his scientific work. Moving from Cambridge to London also transformed Newton's social life. After decades of relative seclusion, he now found himself at the centre of British intellectual and political society. He took up residence in a comfortable house on Jermyn Street, where he employed several servants and lived in a style befitting his new status. For perhaps the first time in his life, Newton entertained guests regularly, hosting dinners where scientific and philosophical topics were discussed late into the night. Among his frequent visitors was his niece Catherine Barton, a charming and intelligent young woman who became his housekeeper and hostess. Catherine's presence brought a domestic warmth to Newton's household that had long been absent. Through her connections, she was rumoured to be romantically involved with Newton's patron Charles Montague. Newton's circle expanded to include not just scientists, but politicians, artists and literary figures. Despite these new responsibilities and social engagements, Newton did not abandon his intellectual pursuits entirely. He supervised the publication of second and third editions of the Principia, making corrections and refinements to his earlier work. And with the death of his old rival Robert Hooke in 1703, Newton finally felt comfortable publishing his long-withheld treatise on optics. Released in 1704, Optics presented Newton's experimental work on light and colour in a more accessible form than the mathematically dense Principia, written in English rather than Latin, and emphasizing experimental results that could be replicated by others. The book reached a wider audience than his previous work. Its publication cemented Newton's reputation as the foremost natural philosopher of his age. That same year brought another significant honour. Newton was elected President of the Royal Society, the premier scientific organisation in Britain. It was a position he would hold for the remainder of his life, wielding his influence to shape the direction of British science for nearly a quarter century. Newton's tenure as president was marked by both significant achievements and controversial exercises of power. He helped the society move to a new building. He grew its library, cleaned up its accounts, brought order to its chaos, just as he once had with the cosmos. Under his leadership, the society began publishing philosophical transactions on a more consistent schedule, enhancing its role as a clearinghouse for scientific ideas. However, Newton also used his position to settle old scores and promote his own views, sometimes at the expense of open scientific inquiry. He packed the society's governing council with his supporters and used his authority to suppress ideas that contradicted his own theories. The most notorious example of this tendency emerged in his dispute with German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over the invention of calculus. The calculus controversy, as it came to be known, represented one of the most bitter priority disputes in scientific history. Newton had developed his method of fluxions, calculus, in the 1660s, but had not published it at the time. Leibniz independently developed similar methods in the 1670s and published his work in 1684, using a notation that many mathematicians found more accessible than Newton's. As Leibniz's calculus gained adherents across Europe, Newton and his supporters became increasingly concerned about establishing Newton's priority. The dispute came to a head in 1711 when the Royal Society, under Newton's presidency, appointed a committee to investigate the matter. Unsurprisingly, the committee, composed largely of Newton's allies, found in his favour, concluding that Leibniz had plagiarized Newton's work. Modern historians of mathematics generally agree that both men developed calculus independently, with Newton working out his methods earlier, but Leibniz publishing first. The notation and approach that eventually became standard owed more to Leibniz than to Newton, suggesting that the scientific community ultimately rendered its own verdict on the controversy. The calculus dispute exemplified Newton's complex personality, brilliant and innovative, yet also deeply insecure and vindictive when he felt his achievements were being questioned or appropriated by others. These contradictory qualities were evident throughout his later years, as he alternated between magnanimous public service and petty vendettas against perceived rivals. Newton's fame continued to grow during his later years. In 1705, he was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac Newton, an extraordinary honour for someone of his relatively humble birth. The knighthood recognised not just his scientific achievements, but also his service to the nation as Master of the Mint. It symbolised Newton's successful transition from reclusive scholar to public figure and statesman of science. With fame came increased scrutiny of Newton's religious views, which remained unorthodox by the standards of his day. Throughout his life, Newton had privately rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, believing it to be a corruption of early Christian teaching. This theological position, Arianism as it was called, could have had serious consequences for Newton's career and reputation had it become widely known during his time at Cambridge, where all faculty were required to be ordained in the Church of England. In London, with greater religious toleration and his own enhanced status, Newton felt more comfortable allowing glimpses of his theological investigations to emerge. Though he never published his religious writings during his lifetime, he devoted thousands of pages to biblical chronology, prophecy interpretation, and early church history, seeking to recover what he believed was the pure original Christianity that had been corrupted by later theological developments. Newton's approach to biblical study reflected the same mental qualities evident in his scientific work: meticulous attention to detail, comprehensive examination of evidence, and a willingness to question established authorities. He learned Hebrew to read the Old Testament in its original language, compiled detailed chronologies of ancient kingdoms to establish the historical context of biblical events, and wrote extensive commentaries on prophetic texts, particularly the books of Daniel and Revelation. For Newton, there was no contradiction between his scientific and religious inquiries. Both represented attempts to understand the divine order underlying creation. He viewed the universe as a cryptogram set by the Creator and saw the task of the natural philosopher as deciphering this divine code. As Newton aged, his health gradually declined, though his mind remained sharp. He suffered increasingly from digestive problems, possibly exacerbated by his earlier alchemical experiments, which had involved tasting small amounts of mercury and other toxic substances. By the 1720s, he was troubled by bladder stones, a painful condition that periodically left him bedridden. Despite these physical challenges, Newton remained active in his multiple roles. He continued to preside over the Royal Society, oversee operations at the Mint, and engage in correspondence with scientists across Europe. His home in London became a destination for visiting scholars seeking audience with the man widely regarded as the greatest mind of the age. In his final years, Newton was cared for by his niece Catherine and her husband John Conduit, who had become his assistant at the Mint. Conduit would later compile biographical information about his famous uncle-in-law, preserving valuable details about Newton's life and personality that might otherwise have been lost. Isaac Newton died on the morning of March 20, 1727. He had been in pain for days, weakened by age and illness, but his mind remained clear. He passed away quietly in his London home. He was 84 years old, an impressive age for that era, and fully lucid until the end. According to Conduit, Newton refused pain medications the night before his death, saying that they would cloud his thinking as he contemplated his passage from this world. In his last hours, Newton is said to have reflected on his life with characteristic humility, mixed with awareness of his achievements. "I do not know what I may appear to the world," he told those gathered at his bedside, "but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." News of Newton's death spread quickly through London and across Europe, prompting an outpouring of tributes from scientists, philosophers, and statesmen. His body lay in state in Westminster Abbey's Jerusalem chamber, where the public could pay their respects to the man who had revealed the mathematical principles governing the universe. On March 28, Newton was interred in Westminster Abbey with full honours, an extraordinary tribute for someone who was neither royalty nor high clergy. The funeral procession included the Lord Chancellor, 2 dukes, and 3 earls who served as pallbearers, along with the Fellows of the Royal Society, walking 2 by 2 in solemn procession. Alexander Pope, the celebrated poet who had once met Newton, would later compose an epitaph that perfectly captured the revolutionary nature of Newton's achievement. "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Newton's grave in the nave of Westminster Abbey was later adorned with an elaborate monument designed by the architect William Kent and executed by the sculptor Michael Rysbrack. The marble monument depicts Newton in classical robes, reclining against a stack of his own books, the Principia, Optics, Chronology, and Divinity. Above him, a carved globe shows the path of a famous comet from 1680. Nearby, small angelic figures, cherubs, hold symbols of his greatest discoveries, light, gravity, and numbers. The Latin inscription celebrates him as the greatest genius who ever lived. In the immediate aftermath of Newton's death, John Conduit, who had married Newton's niece Catherine, succeeded him as Master of the Mint. Edmund Halley of comet fame replaced Newton as the most prominent British astronomer, while a French admirer of Newton, Voltaire, began the work of popularizing his ideas throughout continental Europe. The disposition of Newton's substantial estate, worth approximately £32,000, equivalent to millions in today's currency, reflected the contradictions in his character. Despite his humble origins and occasional pettiness over small sums, Newton died a wealthy man through a combination of his mint salary, wise investments, and frugal habits. Yet he left no will, requiring his estate to be divided among his half-siblings and their children according to intestacy laws. This oversight seems strange for a man so methodical in other aspects of his life, but perhaps reflects Newton's lifelong emotional detachment from his family. More complex was the fate of Newton's enormous collection of unpublished papers. These included not just scientific notes, but extensive writings on alchemy, biblical chronology, and theological topics that could have damaged his reputation had they become widely known during his lifetime. His heirs, recognizing the potential value of these manuscripts but uncertain what to do with them, initially kept them private. When scholars were finally allowed to examine selected portions of Newton's papers, they were astonished at the breadth of his interests. The mathematical physicist, who had unlocked the secrets of universal gravitation, had devoted at least as much time to deciphering biblical prophecies and searching for the philosopher's stone. This seeming contradiction between Newton the rational scientist and Newton the mystical alchemist and theologian would perplex biographers for generations. Many of Newton's scientific papers were eventually donated to Cambridge University, while others were sold at auction in 1936, dispersing his intellectual legacy across various libraries and private collections. Only in recent decades have scholars been able to piece together a more complete picture of Newton's mental world through careful study of these scattered manuscripts. In the years immediately following Newton's death, his scientific legacy was primarily carried forward by continental scientists rather than his British countrymen. In France, Voltaire, who had met Newton shortly before his death, became an enthusiastic popularizer of Newtonian science, helping to displace the physical theories of Descartes that still dominated French thought. In his Letters on England, Voltaire contrasted Newton's empirical approach with Descartes' more speculative method, declaring, "A Frenchman arriving in London finds a great change in philosophy. As in everything else, he left the world full. He finds it empty." Émilie du Châtelet, a French noblewoman and Voltaire's companion, produced the first French translation of the Principia, adding her own insightful commentary that helped make Newton's difficult mathematics more accessible. Her work was instrumental in spreading Newtonian physics throughout continental Europe, where the more abstract approach of Leibniz had previously held sway. Meanwhile, in the Dutch Republic, Willems Gravesander designed experimental demonstrations of Newton's principles that made them accessible to a wider audience. These experiments, showing how objects of different weights fall at the same rate in a vacuum, or how colliding objects follow Newton's laws of motion, helped transform Newtonian physics from an abstract mathematical theory into a tangible description of the physical world that could be verified through direct observation. In Newton's native England, his immediate influence was perhaps more institutional than intellectual. His long presidency of the Royal Society had established patterns of scientific organization and communication that would persist for generations. The prestige he brought to British science helped secure social and financial support for scientific research, even as the cutting edge of theoretical innovation temporarily shifted to the continent. In the century since his death, Newton's influence has only grown. Science, philosophy, even the way we think about thinking, he left his mark on all of it. Einstein would later describe him the brilliant mind that stands at the cradle of modern science, while the physicist Richard Feynman declared, "Newton is the greatest scientist who ever lived," because of his ability to integrate observations and mathematical laws into a complete explanation of the physical world. Newton's mathematical approach to physics, formulating precise laws that could be expressed as equations and tested against observation, established the pattern for scientific research that would dominate for the next 300 years. His integration of celestial and terrestrial physics into a unified framework overthrew 2,000 years of Aristotelian division between the heavens and earth, paving the way for our modern understanding of a universe governed by universal natural laws. The calculus Newton developed with Leibniz provided scientists with a powerful mathematical tool for describing change and motion, enabling advances in fields from astronomy to engineering to economics. Though Newton's notation was eventually supplanted by Leibniz's more intuitive symbols, the fundamental concepts of differentiation and integration that he pioneered remain essential to scientific and mathematical education today. In optics, Newton's experimental demonstration that white light contains all the colors of the spectrum laid the foundation for our understanding of the nature of light and color. His work on telescopes, particularly his invention of the reflecting telescope design, transformed astronomical observation, allowing astronomers to build instruments free from the chromatic aberration that had limited earlier telescopes. Even to this day, when we look into deep space from orbiting telescopes like Hubble and Webb, we're still using Newton's mirror. Newton's three laws of motion provided a comprehensive framework for understanding mechanical systems that remained unchallenged until the development of quantum mechanics and relativity theory in the early 20th century. Even then, Newtonian mechanics remained and remains perfectly adequate for calculating the trajectories of cannonballs, the orbits of planets, or the flight paths of spacecraft within our solar system. His law of universal gravitation, the insight that every particle of matter attracts every other particle with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them, revealed the mathematical order underlying the apparent chaos of celestial motions. Though Einstein's general relativity would later provide a more complete description of gravity as the curvature of space-time, Newton's equations remain sufficiently accurate for most practical applications, from predicting tides to calculating satellite orbits. Beyond his specific scientific discoveries, Newton's greatest legacy may be the scientific method he exemplified: careful observation, mathematical modeling, experimental testing, and the formulation of universal laws capable of making precise predictions about phenomena not yet observed. This approach transformed natural philosophy from a largely speculative enterprise into a rigorous discipline capable of uncovering the fundamental principles governing the physical world. Newton's influence extended far beyond the realm of physical science. His demonstration that the universe operates according to mathematical laws, discoverable through human reason, became a foundational assumption of the Enlightenment, inspiring thinkers in fields from political philosophy to economics to apply similar principles to human affairs. The philosophers of the Enlightenment looked to Newton's achievements as proof that human reason could penetrate the mysteries of nature and society alike. As Alexander Pope's famous couplet put it, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." This almost religious reverence for Newton's accomplishment reflected the profound impact his work had on humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. In economics, Adam Smith explicitly modeled his concept of the invisible hand of market forces on Newton's invisible force of gravity, seeking to discover the natural laws governing human exchange, just as Newton had uncovered those governing planetary motion. Political philosophers like John Locke, and later Thomas Jefferson, drew inspiration from Newton's orderly cosmos to envision societies constructed on rational principles, discoverable through human reason. Even aesthetics and literature felt Newton's influence. English gardens of the 18th century, with their carefully calculated natural landscapes, reflected a Newtonian sensibility that saw hidden mathematical order underlying apparent spontaneity. The poets of the Romantic movement, though often reacting against mechanical views of nature, nevertheless engaged deeply with Newton's unveiling of cosmic order, from William Blake's mystical visions of Newton's sleep to William Wordsworth's celebration of the mind of Newton voyaging through strange seas of thought alone. In the centuries since his death, Newton has been honoured in countless ways. His image has appeared on British banknotes, stamps and coins. Craters on both the Moon and Mars bear his name, as does Newton, the SI unit of force. Newtona, a genus of birds, was named after him, as was the element newtonium, though this name was eventually discarded in favour of Copernicium. Statues of Newton stand in the courtyards of Trinity College, Cambridge, the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and the British Library. Newton's personal effects have become treasured artefacts. The Royal Society preserves his reflecting telescope, while Trinity College displays a lock of his hair. The famous apple tree at Woolsthorpe Manor, or rather its descendant, grown from a cutting of the original, continues to bear fruit, and saplings propagated from it have been planted at research institutions around the world as symbols of scientific inspiration. His childhood home, Woolsthorpe Manor, is now a museum operated by the National Trust, allowing visitors to stand in the very room where the young Newton conducted his prism experiments during the plague years. His London residence has not survived, but a blue plaque marks the site where it once stood. In the academic world, the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge, which Newton once held, remains one of the most prestigious positions in mathematics and theoretical physics. Its subsequent occupants have included luminaries such as Charles Babbage, Paul Dirac, and Stephen Hawking, each a revolutionary thinker in their own right, yet each standing, as Newton himself once put it, on the shoulders of giants. Perhaps the most telling measure of Newton's legacy is how thoroughly his ideas have been absorbed into our collective understanding of the physical world. Concepts that required mathematical genius to discover in the 17th century are now taught to high school students as fundamental principles. Each time a civil engineer calculates the forces on a bridge, each time an aerospace engineer plots the trajectory of a rocket, each time an astronomer predicts the position of a celestial body, they are applying Newton's insights, often without conscious acknowledgement of their intellectual debt. Yet for all his towering scientific achievement, the personal Newton remains enigmatic. Was he, as economist John Maynard Keynes famously described him, not the first of the age of reason, but the last of the magicians? Or was he, as physicist Steven Weinberg suggests, thoroughly modern in his insistence on mathematical models tested against observation, regardless of his personal interests in alchemy and biblical prophecy. Perhaps both perspectives capture something essential about this complex figure who straddled medieval and modern worldviews. Newton's mind encompassed both rigorous mathematical analysis and mystical contemplation of divine order. He could spend years performing careful experiments on light and matter, while also searching ancient texts for coded messages about the apocalypse. He developed a mechanistic model of the cosmos, yet saw in that very mechanism evidence of divine design and providence. What remains indisputable is Newton's profound impact on human understanding. Before Newton, the movements of planets and the fall of apples seemed disconnected phenomena, governed by different principles. After Newton, humanity possessed a unified mathematical framework that revealed the same forces operating throughout the cosmos, from the smallest particles to the grandest celestial bodies. In providing this framework, Newton did more than advance science. He transformed our conception of our place in the universe. No longer was Earth the unique center of creation, separate from the heavens. Instead, it was one planet among many, all following the same mathematical laws. Humans were not outside nature, but part of it, capable, through reason and careful observation, of deciphering its underlying principles. 3 centuries after his death, as spacecraft navigate the solar system using his equations and scientists continue to build upon his insights, Newton's quiet revolution continues. Each new discovery in physics, astronomy, mathematics and optics extends the edifice he began constructing during those solitary plague years at Woolsthorpe, proving the enduring power of a mind that dared to seek universal principles amid the chaotic complexity of the physical world. The boy who once watched an apple fall in a Lincolnshire garden grew into a man who revealed the mathematical harmony underlying all falling things, from raindrops to comets, from tides to orbiting moons. With thought and careful observation, he uncovered truths so simple, so deep, that they became part of how we see the world. They have become the foundation upon which centuries of scientific progress have been built. Newton's legacy reminds us that the greatest revolutions often begin not with dramatic public gestures, but with quiet, persistent questioning, with the courage to wonder why things fall as they do, why light separates into colors, why planets trace elliptical paths through the void. It teaches us that behind the apparent chaos of phenomena lie elegant mathematical patterns waiting to be discovered by those patient and perceptive enough to discern them. Perhaps the true measure of Newton's genius lies not just in what he solved, but in what he enabled others to solve, in the mathematical language he helped develop, the scientific methods he refined, and the cosmic questions he framed in ways that allowed subsequent generations to extend his insights ever further into the architecture of reality. As we continue to explore the universe, Newton helped us understand from quantum realms he could never have imagined to distant galaxies he glimpsed only as faint points of light. We remain beneficiaries of that singular moment when a solitary thinker looked beyond appearances to perceive the invisible forces binding all matter together, forever changing humanity's place in the cosmos. In Newton's own humble, yet knowing words, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," and now, centuries later, it is Newton's own shoulders upon which all modern science stands. And so we find ourselves contemplating the endless ripples of one life across the vast ocean of human understanding, as Newton's insights continue to flow outward through time, like concentric circles expanding from a single dropped stone, touching shore after distant shore of human thought, resonating still in the quiet chambers of universities and research laboratories and space agencies, in the calculations performed by spacecraft traveling beyond our solar system, in the theories that attempt to unify the forces he first described with such elegant precision. The universal nature of gravity, that invisible thread connecting every particle to every other particle across the boundless expanse of cosmos, serves as a fitting metaphor for the intellectual gravity of Newton himself, a force that continues to pull at the orbits of our collective understanding, shaping the trajectories of countless minds drawn into the powerful field of his insights. Each generation adding their own small contributions to the mathematical tapestry he first began to weave in that quiet Lincolnshire garden. Like light passing through a prism, Newton's genius separated the spectrum of natural philosophy into distinct and recognizable bands, each wavelength of thought becoming visible, where before there had been only an undifferentiated glow of speculation and supposition. His disciplined mind, bringing focus and clarity to what had previously been but shadows on the cave wall of human perception, transforming the ancient quest to understand nature's hidden mechanisms into a systematic exploration guided by mathematics and careful observation. The apple that supposedly fell before his contemplative gaze, whether literal fruit or merely convenient symbol, has multiplied into countless conceptual orchards, bearing the fruit of technologies and insights that Newton himself could scarcely have imagined, yet which trace their roots back to the mathematical soil he first cultivated with such patient attention, proving that even the most abstract theoretical seeds, when planted in the fertile ground of human curiosity, can in time yield practical harvests beyond measure. In those quiet Cambridge rooms where Newton pored over calculations by candlelight, measuring the motions of celestial bodies and dividing light into its component colours, he could not have known how his solitary labours would eventually illuminate paths that would lead humanity beyond the confines of Earth itself. His equations guiding metal vessels through the void between worlds, his understanding of universal forces allowing us to break the ancient bonds that once kept us forever earthbound, transforming our relationship with the cosmos, he had mapped with such precision. The reflecting telescope that Newton crafted with his own hands, grinding the mirror and assembling the tube that would gather distant starlight without the chromatic aberrations that had plagued earlier instruments, stands as a tangible embodiment of his approach to natural philosophy, an elegant solution to a complex problem, achieved through a combination of theoretical insight and practical craft, enhancing humanity's vision of the cosmos in ways that would multiply through centuries of refinement, culminating in the great observatories that now orbit our planet. Their mirrors descendants of that first reflecting surface, Newton polished so carefully. Like the light that travels for years from distant stars before reaching our telescopes, Newton's thoughts continue their journey through the intellectual firmament, connecting us to that singular moment when one human mind glimpsed the mathematical harmony underlying apparent chaos, a moment whose illumination has not diminished with the passage of time, but has rather been augmented by each subsequent discovery that confirms or extends the principles he first articulated in his quiet, methodical way. The prism experiments through which Newton demonstrated that white light contains all colours within itself mirror his own intellectual legacy, which contained within it the seeds of countless scientific disciplines that would eventually separate and develop along their own paths, each following a trajectory set in motion by his initial insights, yet all remaining connected to that original source, that fundamental light of understanding that first passed through the focusing lens of his remarkable mind. When we look up at the night sky and comprehend that the same force keeping our feet firmly on the ground also guides the moon in its orbit, and Jupiter's satellites in their celestial dance, we are participating in Newton's vision, seeing with eyes that he helped open to the underlying unity of physical forces, perceiving connections that remained hidden for millennia until his mathematical genius revealed them, changing forever how humanity understands its place within the cosmic pattern. The calculus that flowed from Newton's quill, a mathematical language capable of describing change with unprecedented precision, continues to serve as the essential grammar for our descriptions of a dynamic universe, allowing us to model everything from the flow of ocean currents to the expansion of the cosmos itself, proving that abstract symbols arranged with sufficient insight can capture the very essence of physical reality, translating the book of nature into terms the human mind can comprehend and manipulate. In the quiet spaces between stars, in the mathematical relationships governing particles too small for the eye to see, in the predictable arcs of projectiles and the perfect ellipses of planetary orbits, Newton's understanding continues to illuminate the hidden architecture of reality, revealing the elegant simplicity underlying apparent complexity, the order emerging from seeming chaos, the universal principles manifesting through countless particular instances, all confirming the fundamental insight that the cosmos operates according to laws accessible to human reason. The passage of centuries has not diminished, but rather magnified Newton's achievement, as each new discovery in physics and astronomy has served to confirm the foundational nature of his insights, building upon rather than replacing his understanding, extending rather than contradicting his vision, proving that certain kinds of knowledge, once attained, become permanent possessions of humanity, landmarks on our collective journey toward comprehending the universe we inhabit. When Newton wrote that he had seen further by standing on the shoulders of giants, he acknowledged his debt to those who came before, while simultaneously extending an invitation to future generations, inviting them to climb higher still using the intellectual framework he had established, creating a kind of immortality through the ongoing conversation between minds, separated by time, yet united in their quest to understand nature's deepest principles. The quiet certainty of Newton's equations, stripped of unnecessary elaboration and reduced to their essential mathematical form, stands in contrast to the complex personality of the man who formulated them, a reminder that the products of human genius often transcend the limitations and contradictions of their creators, taking on a life independent of their origins, speaking with a clarity and universality that reaches beyond the particular circumstances of their birth. In the silence of gravitational attraction, in the invisible pull that keeps celestial bodies in their courses through the void, we find an apt metaphor for Newton's continuing influence on human thought, subtle, yet immensely powerful, operating across vast distances of time and culture, maintaining its essential character despite the development of more refined theories, remaining fundamental even as our understanding has expanded to encompass realms he never imagined. The mathematical harmony Newton perceived underlying the apparent chaos of physical phenomena represents a kind of music of the spheres that continues to play through human consciousness, a composition whose themes have been elaborated and developed by subsequent thinkers, yet whose basic melody remains recognizable, a testament to the enduring power of his original insights and the remarkable ability of mathematical language to capture essential truths about the physical world. When light passes through raindrops to form a rainbow, each observer sees a slightly different arc depending on their position, yet all are witnessing the same fundamental phenomenon that Newton first explained through his prism experiments, a fitting symbol for how different generations and cultures have perceived Newton's legacy through the prism of their own concerns and contexts, each glimpsing aspect particularly relevant to their time, while the underlying spectrum of his contribution remains constant. The mechanical universe Newton described, with its clockwork precision and mathematical predictability, may have been supplemented by the quantum uncertainties and relativistic curvatures discovered by later physicists, yet the Newtonian framework remains not only valid within its proper domain, but essential to our practical navigation of the physical world, proving that scientific progress often involves not the wholesale replacement of earlier understanding, but its incorporation into more comprehensive frameworks. In the silent fall of apples, in countless orchards around the world, in the predictable arcs of fountains, in the precise orbits of artificial satellites, Newton's insights continue their quiet work, governing phenomena so familiar, we rarely pause to consider the profound understanding they represent, the once revolutionary perspective that has become integrated into our collective consciousness so thoroughly that we can scarcely imagine a time when these relationships were not understood. The pages of the Principia, filled with geometric diagrams and mathematical proofs, represent far more than an artifact of intellectual history. They constitute a moment of transition in humanity's relationship with the cosmos, the point at which abstract mathematics and physical reality were united in a comprehensive system that revealed the underlying order of the universe, an achievement whose significance continues to reverberate through every branch of natural science. When Newton wrote that truth is ever to be found in simplicity, he expressed a principle that guided not only his own scientific work, but continues to guide the development of physical theories to this day, the search for the most elegant and economical explanations capable of accounting for observed phenomena, the faith that beneath the bewildering complexity of nature lie patterns and principles accessible to the human mind through the language of mathematics. The law of universal gravitation, expressed in a single elegant equation that applies equally to falling apples and orbiting planets, stands as perhaps the most perfect example of Newton's genius for discerning unity within diversity, for perceiving the common thread connecting seemingly disparate phenomena, for reducing complex systems to their essential governing principles, an approach that continues to characterize the most profound advances in our understanding of the physical world. In the silent spaces between planets, in the vast emptiness that Newton recognized as being not truly empty, but rather suffused with invisible forces acting across distances, we find a parallel to the apparent gaps in human history that are in fact connected by the continuous thread of ideas passing from mind to mind across generations, Newton himself serving as both recipient and transmitter in this grand conversation about the nature of reality. The mechanical philosophy that Newton brought to its culmination, with its vision of the cosmos as an intricate mechanism operating according to mathematical laws, provided humanity with a model of the universe that, if no longer considered complete, nevertheless continues to inform our approach to physical problems and our faith in the ultimate comprehensibility of nature through patient observation and mathematical analysis. The three laws of motion, stated with such apparent simplicity, yet containing implications of profound complexity, continue to serve as the foundation for our understanding of the physical world, each generation of students rediscovering through them the elegant relationship between force and mass and acceleration, between action and reaction, between inertia and change, principles so fundamental they have become woven into the fabric of our collective understanding. In the gravitational dance of binary stars circling their common center of mass across unimaginable distances, in the delicate balance of forces that shapes galaxies and governs the evolution of the cosmos itself, Newton's understanding continues to illuminate phenomena he could never have observed, proving the remarkable extensibility of truly fundamental insights, their ability to transcend the limitations of the context in which they were first formulated. The patient precision with which Newton ground his telescope mirrors and conducted his optical experiments reflects the same quality of mind that allowed him to perceive mathematical patterns underlying physical phenomena, an attention to detail combined with an ability to discern larger significance, a commitment to exactitude in service of broader understanding, an approach to nature that balances meticulous observation with bold theoretical synthesis. In the silent falling of snow on winter evenings, in the predictable arcs of water from garden sprinklers on summer afternoons, in the curve of a thrown ball and the swing of a pendulum, Newtonian physics continues its quiet governance of our everyday experience, providing the reliable framework within which we navigate the physical world, so thoroughly integrated into our understanding that we move through its principles as unselfconsciously as fish through water. The mathematical language Newton helped develop to describe a universe in motion continues to evolve and expand, applied now to phenomena he could never have imagined, from the formation of black holes to the expansion of the universe itself. Yet still recognizably connected to those first equations he scratched on paper by candlelight, proving that certain kinds of knowledge possess a generative quality that transcends their original context. When autumn leaves drift slowly to the ground each year, following paths determined by the interplay of gravity and air resistance, they reenact the very phenomena that first captured Newton's attention in that Lincolnshire garden, reminding us that the most profound scientific insights often begin with attention to the commonplace, with the willingness to see the universal in the particular, the cosmic significance in everyday occurrences. The precision with which we can predict celestial events, from solar eclipses to the return of comets, stands as perhaps the most visible testament to the power of Newton's approach to natural philosophy, the remarkable alignment between mathematical prediction and observed reality, serving as continuous confirmation of his fundamental insight that the cosmos operates according to consistent and comprehensible principles. In the silent turning of the seasons, in the reliable progression of tides responding to lunar gravity, in the predictable paths of planets around the sun, we witness the continuing verification of Newton's understanding, each completed orbit and each returning comet, adding another layer of confirmation to principles first articulated